and welcome to this week's episode of Primer Plus. We're talking about The Splendid and the Vile. It's a book by Erik Larson, and I'm joined today by Mr. Jerry Lenaburg. My name is Melissa Rihl. I'm a contributor for Personal Primer Podcast. Mr. Jerry Lenaburg is a project manager and senior military analyst with over 30 years experience in the defense and intelligence community, where he's written extensively on military and national security topics relating to both conventional and unconventional warfare. And in 1987, he graduated from the U.S. Naval Academy with a BS in history, where he was a member of Phi Alpha Theta, and he also holds an MS in technology management and an MA in military studies. He's known on the world of Instagram as the grouchy historian, and just a wealth of knowledge. So Jerry, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you for inviting me to be here.
Yeah. So first of all, I know you said you hadn't heard about the book. I said, Jerry, can you read this book and we'll talk about it? So what's your first take on the book?
It was great. No, I probably never would have picked up this book if you hadn't recommended it and said, hey, can you read this book and we'll talk about it? But it was really good. I finished it in about 3 days. It's kind of one of those unique history books that's an actual page turner. You really learn a lot of interesting little quirks about Winston Churchill and his family in this book, which is what it's about. But it's really, I think, also an interesting leadership study for people who want to know how to handle probably the biggest crisis that Western civilization has ever faced. So it was a great book.
Yes. And for those who, haven't read it, you can pick it up. But it's important to note it is nonfiction. So it's not just, somebody's fictionalized idea. A lot of research.
It kind of reads like fiction,
but
does. It's the real deal.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So definitely everything is super accurate. So this book's described as a saga of Churchill family and defiance during the Blitz. So just to kick things off, can you tell us about the Blitz and how this particular moment in history sets the tone for Great Britain and really the world going forward?
Right. So when you recommended the book and I started reading it, something came to mind that I've maintained for a long time, which you look at those, key people in history, right? That were sort of the ultimate man in the ultimate place in the ultimate time. And in my opinion, Winston Churchill is probably the most critical person of the 20th century. And I'll explain why. I think he was, like George Washington. Nobody could be George Washington. Nobody could be Winston Churchill. So the book kind of starts out right after World War II has started, but before the beginning of the German campaign in 1940. So Winston Churchill has been an interesting character all his life. So Winston Churchill, at the beginning of World War II, is the first Lord of the Admiralty. So he's basically kind of like the Secretary of the Navy, right? He had a very long relationship with the Royal Navy. So he's in the British government, but he's not the Prime Minister. Churchill, throughout all of the 30s, had been warning Britain of the dangers of Nazi Germany and Hitler, and they didn't listen to him. They spent most of the 30s trying to appease Hitler up until the point that Hitler invaded Poland in 1939. So in 1940, everybody's waiting to see what Hitler's going to do. They expect he's going to invade France, and they're waiting, they're anticipating. When Hitler invades France, the day that he invades France, the government of Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain suffers a vote of no confidence. And this is one of those key moments in history, right? So the king in the British government, right, the king asks a member of parliament to form a government, right, to in effect become the prime minister. So at this key moment in history, Winston Churchill wasn't the first choice. No. Everybody thought he was sort of brash. He was impetuous, all very true. And they thought he was kind of a dilettante to a certain extent too. Everybody in the government, everybody that was in the know, expected that the king would have asked Lord Halifax to form a government. Interestingly enough, though, Chamberlain recommends Churchill to him, which is interesting because Churchill was not a fan of Chamberlain. The king asked Churchill to form a government the day the Nazis, like I said, the day the Nazis start their invasion of Western Europe. Churchill pretty much says, I've been waiting for this my entire life. My entire life, everything he's done. And if you've ever read his bio, it's amazing the guy lived to be as old as he. I mean, he pretty much, he was like, it was that guy, Anthony Bourdain, and, all of these crazy traveler adventures before there were crazy travelers adventures, right? So the king asked him to form a government. The British establishment, again, was very divided on this. Some of them it's like, great, Winston's just the man. Other people's like, Churchill, he's a nut. So the Germans kind of defy everyone's expectations and crush the French in 6 weeks. Everybody expected World War II to be like World War I, only worse, right? And the Germans, because of the new technologies of the tank and the airplane, accomplish in 6 weeks what they couldn't do in 4 years in World War I. They drive the British from the continent. They basically overrun the French army and force an armistice with France in June of 1940. So at this point, we see what begins the Battle of Britain, right? Hitler is basically the master of Western Europe. He's overrun Norway, Denmark, Belgium, France, Holland. Italy is his ally. He's basically invaded everything except Switzerland and Spain and conquered it all. So the British, of course, are holding out on their own. This is where Churchill's effect as the most important person of the 20th century comes into play, because Churchill refuses to even think of negotiating with Hitler. There was, in fact, a pretty sizable portion of the British government that says, holy cow, Hitler is unstoppable. The Nazi war machine is invincible. They're coming for us. Maybe we make a deal now to preserve the empire. Churchill had none of that. He's like, Hitler is evil. Nazism is evil. Britain is going to stand fast. So the problem is, and of course, Hitler sees these stubborn Englishmen over there across the English Channel, and he wants to settle the war. Well, okay, so he's got to get the German army across the English Channel. Well, of course, this hasn't been done since 1066, right? Nobody has invaded England. The Germans then decide they're going to launch an air campaign. This is kind of the meat of the book here, is Churchill anticipates that this is what's going to happen. The Germans have to defeat the Royal Air Force in order to be able to invade Britain. And early on, you kind of see Churchill had a pretty ruthless streak too, right? He didn't mess around. As soon as he knew that, as soon as he could tell that the French were defeated and had basically given up, there was a request late in the campaign to send several dozen squadrons of fighters to help out the French campaign. And Churchill kept them back because he knew the French were beaten, but he was going to need those fighters to defend England. The interesting part about the book is it takes a couple of sideshows that I actually was not all that familiar with. The technical part of the battle, the techno wizards, they called it, right? The German navigation beams that allowed them to attack Britain. Back then, because this is how some of us way back in the day still learned how to navigate airplanes. Navigation was not a very precise art, right? There was no GPS. It was all basically dead reckoning. You had an airspeed indicator, you had a watch, you had a map, and you had a compass. And that, if you dropped bombs on England, that was pretty good. That was your target.
Yeah.
But the Germans, of course, had a much more sophisticated system. And of course, the British had radar. So you see the first sort of technical battle in history in the Battle of Britain. But more importantly, Churchill had, I think, a way that you don't see in too many politicians these days of inspiring people. And that came through the book too, right? Churchill was full of ideas, right? He actually used to drive, you got this from the book, used to drive his staff, his military officers, his cabinet secretary with these great ideas. He had lots of ideas. He was a man of action, didn't like bureaucracy, kind of drove him crazy.
Oh, he had so many secretaries.
So many, yeah. Now this was classic Winston Churchill, right? The best part of this book for me is you see Churchill as a person, and he had more quirks. I mean, come on. The guy, first of all, let's be honest, the guy drank like a fish.
Yes.
I mean, the guy woke up, had brandy for breakfast, champagne for lunch, champagne for dinner, more brandy for dinner. He smoked like a chimney.
Mm-hmm. He took 2 baths a day, and he had people recording all the time. Like,
right. So imagine this, that, you know, Winston Churchill gets out of his bathtub, buck naked, puts on a bathrobe, which we hope he ties, but he didn't go into that detail, and like wanders around the bedroom dictating to his secretary, probably with a drink and a cigar. Okay. The other thing that cracked me up, yes, it did, was that he wore pink silk underwear. And I'm like, okay, I really didn't need to know that detail, but okay. The guy saved Western civilization. If he wants to wear pink silk underwear, have at it.
All right.
But he never ever lost confidence that Britain could beat the Germans. And when the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, starts their air campaign, you know, all the really smart people, all the experts are like, yeah, we're not gonna last. The Germans are gonna overrun us. You know, they prepared for invasion. They anticipated that, you know, they did their calculations, right? Because, you know, you have to have weather and tides and moons and all these to launch. So they knew that the optimum time for the Germans to invade would have been September, before winter sets in, right? Because the English Channel in winter, no bueno. So you had this fairly narrow window that the Germans had to win the battle in order to invade England before the end of 1940. And, you know, didn't take a lot of, you know, you could figure that out. So yeah, the battle was very desperate. The couple of things that Churchill did that you see in the book is he got Lord Beaver Brook.
Oh my gosh.
Again, one of those characters, right? If you know, read, the guy's like perpetual whiner.
Yes.
But again, he was the perfect man at the perfect place to increase Britain's aircraft production. And that's what it was, a numbers game. You had to produce pilots and you had to produce airplanes. And you know, Churchill could cajole, wheedle, embarrass, shame, whatever it took to keep the right people in the right job, right? So the between radar and aircraft production and, you know, a lot of determination from Hitler, the British withstand the first round of air attacks. And then if you read the book, you find that almost by mistake, you know, the Germans, again, bombing a target, go off course and bomb London, which of course Churchill has none of this and sends the RAF to bomb Berlin. So now you get into sort of the, you know, manly contest between Hitler and Churchill bombing each other's cities. And now this is when you really get the Blitz that the book kind of adds in the title here, is the Germans now switch to a campaign, not necessarily to defeat the RAF, but to try to bomb Britain into submission, to bomb them to the negotiating table. And the book goes into a really great detail here, which I thought was something that I don't think we think about today in, you know, 21st century America, is how much the civilians in London and these other cities endured and carried on, right? They talk about how, you know, there was shortage of electricity and gas. And of course, because of the U-boats off of England, there were food shortages and rationing and, you know, clothing shortages. And, you know, you think it was bad during the pandemic when they didn't have toilet paper, right?
Yeah.
So you get a sense of the sort of courage that the entire British people had to stand up to the German bombing. And all of this was sort of epitomized by Churchill. They have a couple of his really, some of his finest speeches in the book, right? The, never give up, never surrender. We'll fight them on the beaches. We'll fight them on the hill. And then probably his most famous speech when he talks about, never was so much owed by so few, or so many to so few, talking about the RAF fighter pilots. So as winter comes, Hitler, the Germans clearly don't have the air superiority that they need to launch the invasion, which I don't, there's a lot of speculation about whether they were really serious about it either, because they had no navy. So, how they could have actually gotten a sufficient force across the English Channel in the face of the Royal Navy, which at the time was still, probably still the world's mightiest navy for a while, till the US came in the war.
Yeah.
Even with air superiority, it would have been tough. I mean, they might have been able to hold off the Royal Navy, but amphibious operations are some of the most challenging operation. I mean, you look at the Allies. The Allies spent almost three full years, and definitely a full year and a half, getting ready to invade Normandy. And they had, total air supremacy, total maritime supremacy, mountains of supplies, troops, landing craft. The Germans would have been trying to invade Britain on a shoestring. And, but the bombing of England was still, you look at the numbers of people that were killed, and just the destruction of London and some of the other cities. If you, read the chapter of Coventry in particular, I mean, the idea that you wanted to literally just bomb a city off the map is I think a lot of people just couldn't really process that these days, that you deliberately planned to wipe out a city for the sheer terror bombing of people. But that's what Churchill did. Again, the other part of the interesting part of the book is, his family was also a hot mess. You find that, oftentimes that's true for political leaders, that their families are a hot mess, mostly because they're spending most of their time doing politics. His wife was very supportive.
Oh, yes.
I think that kind of came through the book. She did have a mind of her own, and she didn't always put up with his guff. No. But it kind of came through to me that she knew the weight that he had on his shoulders, right? Because there was still a lot of times, particularly early on in the Blitz, that people are like, why are we putting up with this? Why don't we just make a deal with Hitler? And particularly after it looked like the things were going to heat up in the Mediterranean, and obviously things were not going well with the French. Again, if you look at how ruthless Churchill was, the fact that he actually opened fire on his former allies to keep what he felt was the fear of their navy falling into German hands. He didn't mess around, The other thing that sort of comes through here is you see that Churchill's one great hope was to get America into the war, right? And he started this almost from the beginning with Roosevelt. And you can kind of see the little kabuki dance that the two of them did, because Roosevelt wanted to get in the war, but he couldn't. But he knew that we had to support Britain as much as we could. The deal to swap the destroyers for bases was a real masterpiece of covert diplomacy there. And again, I think he makes the good point. The destroyers really weren't the point. The point was that the Americans were getting involved. And there's a story that said when Churchill heard about Pearl Harbor getting bombed, the night that he heard about Pearl Harbor getting bombed, and that the U.S. was going to get involved with the war city, he went to sleep, and he slept the sleep of the just, because he knew that the war was won at that moment. So the Churchill's leadership, his his steadfast in his goal, his absolutely unshakable determination to defeat Hitler, no matter how long it took or what the cost. If you look at it at the time, for a critical year and a half until the Nazis invaded the Soviet Union, England literally stood as the sole protector of Western civilization, right? Again, that's one of his famous speeches, right? If Hitler had not gone into power and, say, Lord Halifax had formed the government and had decided to make a peace with Hitler, our world would look very, very different today.
Yes.
Which is why I think, again, in my opinion, he was the indispensable man of the 20th century.
Yeah. And I think, that kind of leads into, kind of a follow-up question there. From your studies and of, the War of Britain and military strategy and, what are your personal thoughts on Churchill's response and how he handled that, in inspiring and trying to uphold, the British people while waiting for help?
Yeah, it was, he did it really well. Again, he was not, he had a propensity to put out lots of crazy ideas, but he wasn't a micromanager, right? So the RAF generals and air marshals, sorry, they would be marshals and air marshals that were running the campaign. He basically did his best to give them the resources and let them do the job, right? Now, again, a lot of people think that he, had a lot of crazy ideas, but he loved gadgets too, right? So the mad scientists that he had working on with him to try to defeat the German navigation beams. I mean, this is pure Churchill. Churchill's like, anything that helps me defeat Hitler, bring it to me. I want it. I don't care how crazy the idea is. I don't care whose toes you have to step on. If this is going to help us defeat Hitler, bring it to me. He would cut through the bureaucracy, sometimes to their dismay, to get his way. They don't talk about it a whole lot in the book here, but of course, one of Churchill's, the other things he did very early on was form commandos, and basically the British, they called it the Special Operations Executive, to start striking back at the Germans as soon as possible.
Yeah.
He knew that because his army, their army had barely escaped from the continent and had to leave behind, all of their tanks, trucks, artillery, heavy equipment. I mean, they basically got back to Britain with the clothes on their backs, and if they were lucky, their rifles, but in some cases, not even that. So there was no way that they were going to, invade France for the next 4 years. But he knew it was important psychologically to strike back at the Germans, which is why he sent, the RAF bombers back into Germany as soon as possible. And he never lost faith in the military.
Hey, I lost you for a second. You were talking about 10 Downing Street.
Sorry, had a little unstable internet. He stayed at 10 Downing Street, right? They said how he went to Checkers on the weekend,
Yep.
right? And he did a lot of business at Checkers, right? Because that's how you do business at that stage of government, over cigars, brandy, and in the country. But he was at 10 Downing Street, and it got bombed during some of the air raids. So did Buckingham Palace, right? So he had the right people, he gave them the right tools, he didn't micromanage, but he pushed them to strike back at the Germans, to increase aircraft production, to get back in the war. Most importantly, and he goes into this in a great deal, he did this not just because Britain needed to do it, but he did it to prove that Britain was staying in the war, right? There was this undercurrent in the United States that the British are going to lose. Why are we putting all this money in there? They're not going to hold out. They're not going to win. And Churchill was also very politically astute, and he knew that he had to convince the Americans that A, they could win, and B, that they would do whatever it takes to do so. And he did that really, really well. Again, he was very ruthless when he had to be. And he was also a great diplomat when he had to be. to keep Britain in the war and to keep America moving toward supporting them and being an ally.
Yeah. So along those lines, then, we've been talking about Winston Churchill, and he's somebody that, in a lot of ways, I think comes across just with like a legend, because of just how intense he was.
He was larger than life.
Yeah.
He was
So
truly one of those people that was larger than life. And I think, like a lot of great politicians, he knew it. He knew how to be a showman, right?
yeah.
Because when you're a wartime prime minister, it's not just what you do, it's how you act and how you appear and sort of that aura you put off that, everything's okay. We're in control. Yep. This is tough. Clearly bombs are falling on our heads, but we can take it, right? We can take it. We're going to try to carry on with our lives as best we can. People went to work. They went to work in the factories. They evacuated the kids out to the country. So there's you could see it today, right? Politics is about 49% showmanship and about 51% actual governance.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, he would have been awesome on Instagram. Can you imagine Winston Churchill's Instagram feed? I mean, think about it. People would be, his friends just to find out what brandy he drank and what cigars he smoked. Seriously?
Oh yeah. The ask me anything.
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly.
Even looking at the beginning of towards the beginning of the book, when they're talking about how he kept just large weaponry in the back of his car and a pistol on
back to pistol. Exactly.
Yeah, he's like, you know what, if they're gonna come get me, like, I'm taking some of them with me. And
he would have. There is no doubt. If you read, I started reading a really good biography about him. I mean, he was captured during the Boer War, tried to escape, I don't know, a couple, 3 times before he succeeded. He was in a cavalry charge in either the Sudan or the Northwest, in Indian Northwest. I can't remember what it was. He commanded a battalion in World War I for a little while. I mean, the guy was just, I think today we would have called him an adrenaline junkie.
Yes.
If there was an adventure to be had, he would go try to have it. He was a war correspondent. He was a soldier. He was a politician for a long time. He was First Lord of the Admiralty twice before he was prime minister. I mean, the guy led just an amazing life. And again, all of his experiences up to May of 1940 led him, I believe, to that moment.
Yeah. And I mean, going back to something you said towards the beginning as well, that he embraced it. Like, he knew that that's what he was made for. And he's like, yes, like, we're going to do this. And it was just,
he was excited to be prime minister. He's like, my favorite saying quote, I was born to do this. That's
yes.
That you get that sense from him, that he knew that this was his time, because, again, he had been warning Britain about Hitler for years, and everybody ignored him and said he was a warmonger and blah, blah, blah. And now here he was to save England, which he did.
Yeah. And, going back to something else, Beaverton, Beaver Brook. Wow. Whew. Beaver Brook. He was a newspaper man.
Yep.
Churchill put in charge of building up airplanes.
Yep. He was a pirate. I mean, he was like one of those, he was like, he kind of, if I was to find a modern equivalent, I think of like Richard Branson, right? Richard Branson, Virgin Atlantic, Virgin Records. I mean, the guy just kind of looks like a pirate, and he was, right? Remember, there's that part of the book where Beaver Brook was basically running around cannibalizing aircraft parts, to the chagrin of, the RAF leadership and others. And he's like, I don't care. I got to get aircraft in the air. I'm going to go pick up airplanes, crashed planes, derelict planes, whatever it takes. He didn't care. He wasn't an airplane guy. He was a guy that got stuff done because he ran a media empire back in the days when that was heavy duty blue collar work. You know what I'm saying?
Yep.
So he got things done. Yeah, it was. I was. I mean, I heard of Lord Beaver Brook. I didn't really get all of his background story, but when you see what he got done with the aircraft production, it's just like, yeah, guy knew how to get stuff done, and he and again, he was kind of ruthless about, keeping his factories open, keeping his workers on the production line, and getting the raw materials and everything to put aircraft in the air. And if you study, if you look at an analysis of the battle from both sides, the Germans figured they'd wiped out the RAF twice, and they just kept coming back. And they're like, where are these guys getting all these airplanes? Well, because Beaver Brook was making sure that if a plane got back to England in any sort of shape, there was a good chance that either it went back to flying or it provided parts to other planes to do so, which was the advantage, as they say, of flying over your home turf. If an RAF pilot got had to bail out and survived, chances are he could get back into action. If the airplane could make it back, chances are it could get back into action. The Germans didn't have that advantage. So I know they talk about his daughter going to the bomber in the field, or whatever that particular chapter was, right? Mm-hmm. So yeah, that was one of the many examples of the sort of characters that Churchill just kind of drew to him, because he knew he had this ability to figure out that that's the guy for that job. And everybody's like, he's a newspaper man.
Yeah.
But Churchill's like, that's the guy for that job, because A, he can come straight to me, and B, he doesn't care about the process or the bureaucracy. He's just going to get airplanes built and in the air.
Yeah, it was incredible. So
don't see a lot of that these days in government.
No, you don't.
Just saying.
So why do you think he is a historical figure worth knowing?
Well, again, he literally stood alone against Hitler, and he kept Britain in the war. I think he's a figure worth studying because he's a definite study in contrasts, right? I mean, again, the guy had a lot of quirks, and he had a big personality. But I think if you look at someone who shows how to exhibit steady leadership under extreme pressure, how to exhibit sort of this determination to reach a goal. And, not that he's, not without controversy. Again, he had been fired as First Sea Lord during World War I, because he was the proponent of the British debacle at Gallipoli in Turkey, right? So, he had his ups and downs, and obviously not all his ideas worked out well. But he knew what was he was very prophetic when it came to Hitler. He knew that Hitler was evil and was not going to be appeased, and that you couldn't handle Hitler diplomatically. You had to prepare for war, and you had to be ready to push back against Hitler. So I think he had a very finely tuned sense of what do I want to call it, sort of moral geopolitics. And he I just think he's a fascinating character because he like I said, he was the indispensable man during World War II.
Yes. So this book, in addition to talking about Churchill and, his leadership, focuses a lot on his family. So, we touched on that a little bit towards the beginning. So what impact do you think his family had on him and his response to Hitler and the Blitz?
That's an interesting question. So the couple of things that stood out about his family, his son was kind of what I would call sort of your typical child of privilege.
Yeah.
It just becomes, not to put too fine a point on it, but kind of a wastrel. I mean, he's a gambler, he's a womanizer. I mean, holy cow. I mean,
Lots of
you
debt.
read about how much gambling debts he got into.
Yeah.
And, that's another interesting thing about Churchill, right? The guy was, pretty much broke when the war began, right? And so he wasn't like, a wealthy man of privilege. He wasn't, he wasn't part of the nobility. He was, his father was, so he probably had some title in there somewhere, but he was not like the landed gentry, he wasn't, he would not have been at Downton Abbey or anything like that. So yeah, I think the impression I got from the book was his uh, his wife and his daughter, or his daughter-in-law, tried to kind of shield him as much as they could from his son's issues.
Yeah.
And at some point, um, as we read in the book, his son's wife, before she decided to leave him, basically went to Lord Beaver Brook to help settle the gambling debts, which, it's kind of one of those insider deals that never typically ends well. What I thought was interesting was his daughter, Mary, who was just sort of like the Paris Hilton of the Battle of Britain. I
Oh
mean,
my goodness. Yes.
she just sort of partied. I'm like, when your biggest concern is which nightclub in London to go to, yeah, but his wife, of course, was the quintessential political hostess, right? When
Oh,
people
yes.
came to Checkers, she made sure things were done. I don't know if you noticed, but this was, and if you ever watched Downton Abbey, right? As soon as dinner is done, the women get up and leave, right? And the men get out the cigars and brandy and talk business or politics or both or war, whatever. I thought that was interesting, right? So she had her things, he had his things. She was the hostess, politician's wife, and then she got up and left.
Yeah.
You know,
She also seemed to have no filter. Like,
no, again, she didn't put up with his guff. But she was a very strong woman in that she tried to handle things domestically so that he didn't have to. Because I'm not honestly sure that he would have been all that good at it, because he spent most of his life in politics. I kind of got the impression, I mean, they doted on Mary, clearly.
yeah.
She was the favorite child. They did take care of their older daughter. I think if you read a genuine biography, which I have a couple on the shelf, I think he probably would have been disappointed in his son. I think his son had a lot of potential that he just kind of threw away. And but like everybody else in England, they tried to make sure their children were safe during the Blitz. I mean, their son was in the military, but he didn't really go overseas until they decided that maybe you should go to war because that might be better for you. That's never a good sign when they're like, you need to go join a commando unit and get into combat, because then you're not gambling and womanizing. So yeah, I mean, I'm sure they were as concerned as any other parent was about their children. I mean, eventually, I guess Mary got into the Territorial Army or whatever it was during the war, and her son was in the service. And yeah, so that was the other interesting thing was Pamela, which I guess was the older daughter.
Mm-hmm.
So Pamela, her daughter-in-law, I guess, daughter-in-law. Now I'm confused.
Yes.
Daughter-in-law.
Got a little, they didn't go a ton into,
but she ended up, marrying Averil Harriman. They had an affair, right? So there's always a little scandal, always a little something going on underneath. She had an affair, and then, what was it, 15, 20 years after the war, ended up marrying Averil Harriman for like 15 years until he died. And I'm like, I remember a little bit of their story. I thought they were married much longer than that. I didn't know that they both actually stayed married to their spouses after they cheated on them. And then, when their spouses, I'm just like, wow, there's a soap opera for you. So, yeah, I think like a lot of famous people, his home life was kind of a dumpster fire, not really, something that I think he wanted to emphasize. But his wife loved him. His wife took care of him. Wife probably put him in his place when he needed to. And did the best they could during the Blitz like anybody else.
Yeah. So, kind of closing thoughts. What lessons can leaders draw from how Churchill handled the Blitz?
So I think the first thing is, when you're in well, there's a couple of things. One, when you're in charge, you have to have a single-minded determination of what you want to do. Right? Churchill's single-minded determination was he was not going to give in to Hitler. He was not going to quit. He was not going to give up. Eventually, he was going to defeat Hitler, no matter what it took, no matter how long. And he set his goals, right? He was going to keep Britain in the war. He was going to draw the Americans into the war one way or the other. The Japanese kind of helped him there. And, he was going to do whatever it took to defeat Hitler. I think the second thing was you have to inspire people to want to go above and beyond, right? Like Lord Beaver Brook, like resigned like 6 times or something, right? Like it's like, I quit, I'm done. Churchill's like, no, you're not. Okay, fine. 6 months later, I quit, I'm done. No, you're not, Yeah. So he knew how to, motivate, cajole, wheedle, shame, whatever it was, to keep the right person in the right job. And then he let them do their job, right? He was not a micromanager. He had a lot of crazy ideas, which all bosses tend to do, right? And sometimes, his good ideas were not all that good, but all of his ideas were focused on one thing, which was defeating Hitler. So, single-minded determination, the ability to inspire people, the ability to motivate people, the ability to find the right person, even if it's, a newspaper guy doing aircraft production.
Yeah.
But clearly Churchill saw something in him that said, this is the guy I want. So, you have to have confidence in your ability to pick the right people, which is a really outstanding skill that I wish I had more of. And then you have to, and I think at the phrase is correct, you have to have a certain amount of ruthlessness. You have to be willing to do whatever it takes, not necessarily to, sink the navy of your former ally, but you have to be willing to put in the work and to make hard decisions. I guess that's a better way to say it. You have to make hard decisions that are not always going to be popular. Right? I mean, it was ugly when they attacked the French fleet, and it had ramifications for the rest of the war. When the Allies invaded North Africa in 1942, that was Eisenhower's first big job. The reason was they didn't want to put a British general in charge of it because the French were not too happy with the British at the time. So they had to have an American be in charge of the invasion of North Africa. Hey, we got this guy named Eisenhower. Let's get him to do it. And, so that was a very tough and controversial decision at the time. If you remember reading the book, the Royal Navy guy was practically in, the admiral who was ordered to carry out the attack was practically in tears, but he carried it out because Churchill said it's got to be done.
Yep.
So that's what I would say. You have to be determined. You have to be willing to make hard decisions, pick the right people, put them in the job, and then let them do the job.
Yes. Awesome. And I think for anyone that is looking to learn more about the Blitz, obviously, and Churchill, you should read The Splendid and the Vile. Very good. But Jerry, if you have any other recommendations for, just biographies on Winston Churchill, we can link those.
I have a copy of, there's a couple of good ones. Martin Gilbert has written a really good one. And I just got a copy of Andrew Roberts, who's one of my favorite British historians. Now, keep in mind, these are about yay thick, right? Because I don't read skinny books, right? if it's not at least 600 or 800 pages, it's like a pamphlet. So, but Andrew Roberts and Martin Gilbert have both written really outstanding biographies of Winston Churchill. And like I said, he just led an amazing adventure-filled life. He's like Indiana Jones in pink silk underwear. kind of.
And that's the quote for today.
There you go.
So thank you so much for joining us, Jerry. And thank you to everyone who listened to this week's Primer Plus episode. And if you liked this episode, please subscribe, leave us a 5-star review, and tell a friend. For more information and to find episode notes and additional ammunition, go to personalprimer.com. Thank you so much, Jerry.
Thank you.